Hey, my name is Walter Combs. I'm 68 years old and I live alone in a two-story house on Larkspur Lane, just outside Millbrook, Ohio. The same house my wife Eleanor and I bought 41 years ago when the mortgage payment terrified us both, and the paint on the porch was still wet. It isn't a large house. 3 bedrooms, one of which has been empty since our son moved out in the 90s. A kitchen with a window over the sink that Eleanor used to say caught the morning light better than any window in the county. And a garden out back that I have let go mostly to weeds because I don't have the heart to kneel in the dirt the way she used to. People in town still wave when I drive past in my old Buick. They ask how I'm holding up. I tell them fine, because that's the answer that lets everyone go on with their day, and because the truth that most mornings I wake up and reach for a side of the bed that has been cold for 14 months isn't the kind of thing you say to a man bagging your groceries.
I'm doing all right,
Eleanor
thanks.
died of a stroke on a Tuesday in April, in the kitchen, with the radio still
fine,
playing the
thank you.
weather report. I was in the garage. By the time I got to her, it was already over. There was no long goodbye, no hospital bed, no chance to say the things you think you'll have time to say. Just a sudden terrible quiet where 40 years of noise used to be. After the funeral, people brought casseroles for about 3 weeks, and then, the way it always goes, the casseroles stopped and the phone stopped ringing, and I was just a man alone in a house too big for one plate at the table. I told myself I was fine with that. I told myself a man my age doesn't get to expect much more than fine. That October afternoon, 14 months after we buried her, I drove out to the cemetery on the hill behind St. Andrews, the way I did most Sundays, and knelt down in front of the granite marker with her name on it, Eleanor Ma Combs, beloved wife and mother, and I set down the chrysanthemums I'd bought at the grocery store because I couldn't grow anything decent myself anymore. The wind was cutting through my coat. I told her about our grandson's football game, about the leak in the gutter I still hadn't fixed, about how the house still smelled like her perfume in the hallway closet even though the bottle had been empty for a year. And then, because I am a foolish old man who sometimes says things out loud that he means only for the dead, I said, I'm too old for this, Ellie. Too old to start anything new. I know I've still got years left in me. The doctor says my heart's fine, but I don't have the years it takes to learn somebody new. I don't have that in me anymore. I didn't hear her walk up behind me. The grass was soft from the morning rain. When she spoke, her voice was so close to my ear that I nearly came out of my skin. Not too old for me, she said. I turned around and there was Grace Whitfield, 70 years old, standing in a brown wool coat with a bundle of daisies in her arms, looking down at me, kneeling in front of my dead wife's grave, like she'd just said something ordinary about the weather. Grace had been Eleanor's closest friend for nearly 50 years. They'd met in a church choir when they were both new brides, and stayed close through every version of their lives after that, through babies and miscarriages and a husband of Grace's who drank too much before he died of liver failure 11 years ago, through Eleanor's cancer scare in her 50s that turned out, thank God, to be nothing, through every Thanksgiving and every hospital waiting room. Grace had sat 2 pews behind me at the funeral, her hand pressed flat against her mouth the whole service. I hadn't seen much of her since. I stared up at her from my knees like a man who'd been caught doing something shameful, though I couldn't have told you what. Grace, I said, my voice rough, I didn't mean for anyone to hear that. She knelt down beside me slower than she used to, her knees cracking audibly, and set her daisies next to my chrysanthemums. I come every Sunday too, she said. Just later than you, usually. I saw your truck and I almost turned around. Why didn't you? She looked at the headstone for a long moment before she answered. Because I've been having the same conversation with her, Walter, just in my own head instead of out loud like you, and I got tired of only saying it to a piece of granite. I didn't know what to say to that. The wind moved through the cypress trees along the fence line, and somewhere down the hill a car door slammed, and Grace Whitfield knelt beside me in the wet grass with her hands folded like she was still praying, even though the words had stopped. She'd want you to stop kneeling here every Sunday like it's a punishment, Grace said finally. You know that as well as I do. Maybe I don't want to stop. I didn't say I did either. She looked at me sideways, and there was something in her face, some old, tired honesty that made my chest go tight in a way I hadn't let it go tight in 14 months. I just said I was tired of only saying things to a headstone. We sat there another few minutes without talking, the two of us old enough to know that silence between two people who've known real loss doesn't need filling. When we finally stood, my knees complained as loud as hers had. Can I buy you a coffee, Grace? I asked, and the question surprised me as much as it seemed to surprise her. Not because of anything, just because it's cold, and neither one of us has anybody waiting on us for lunch. She studied me a moment. Eleanor would skin you alive if you let me walk to my car without a coffee after that, she said, and something like a smile moved across her face for the first time since I'd turned around and found her standing there. We ended up at the Millbrook Diner on Route 9, in a booth by the window, 2 cups of coffee going cold between us while we talked about nothing important, her granddaughter's wedding, the price of heating oil, whether the diner's pie was still as good as it used to be. It was the easiest conversation I'd had in over a year, and somewhere in the middle of it I realized I had actually laughed for what felt like the first time since April. When I dropped her back at her car in the cemetery lot, she thanked me for the coffee and said, almost too quickly, that she should get going. Her daughter was expecting her for dinner. I watched her drive off and stood there a long time in the cold, feeling something I hadn't let myself feel in 14 months, something that felt almost like guilt and almost like hope, tangled together so tight I couldn't tell which one was which. That night I sat in Eleanor's old recliner, the one I still hadn't been able to move or replace, and I thought about the 2 of them, young brides in that choir loft 50 years ago, thick as thieves through every hard year life handed them, and I wondered what it meant that the woman who'd known my wife best in this world was the same woman whose voice, saying 4 simple words in a cemetery, had cracked something open in my chest that I thought had sealed shut for good. I didn't call her that week. I told myself it was respect. Respect for Eleanor, respect for the natural order of things. An old man doesn't go chasing after his dead wife's best friend like some teenager with a crush. But respect wasn't really what kept my hand off the phone. It was fear. Fear of what it would mean if I called and she didn't answer the way I hoped. Fear of what it would mean if she did. The following Sunday I drove to the cemetery later than usual on purpose, telling myself I just wanted to avoid the morning frost, though we both knew better. Grace's car was already there when I arrived. She was sitting on the little stone bench near the fence, not kneeling at Eleanor's grave, just sitting, watching the wind move through the grass. I parked and walked over slowly, my chrysanthemums under my arm. "You're here early," I said. I couldn't sleep. She didn't look at me. I kept thinking about last Sunday, about what I said, about being tired of talking to Granite, about the other part. I shouldn't have said it like that, Walter, out loud right there in front of her. It wasn't fair to her memory, and it wasn't fair to you, catching you off guard like that. I sat down on the bench beside her. "Was it true, though?" I asked. "That's the only part that matters to me." She was quiet a long moment. "I've known you 40 years, Walter Combs," she finally said. "I watched you marry my best friend. I stood up at your wedding in a lavender dress I hated. I watched the 2 of you build a whole life, and I was glad for it, genuinely glad, because you were good to her, and she was happy, and that's all I ever wanted for Eleanor. I never once in 40 years let myself think of you as anything but her husband. And now she's gone, and I'm ashamed to admit that somewhere in my grief for her, I found myself grieving something else too. The chance I never let myself consider. I'm 70 years old, Walter. I buried a husband who made my life harder for 30 years before the drink finally took him, and I made my peace with being alone. I wasn't looking for this. I want you to know that. I wasn't sitting around waiting for Eleanor to die so I could have my turn." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth the same way she had at the funeral. "I know that," I said quietly. "I never thought otherwise. Then why does it feel like such a betrayal?" I didn't have an answer for her, not one I trusted enough to say out loud. We sat there another few minutes, the cold working its way into my knees, and then Grace stood, brushed off her coat, and said she needed to get going, and I let her go again, the same as the week before, both of us circling something neither of us was ready to name. But something had shifted between us in that conversation, and over the following weeks I found myself inventing reasons to see her. I brought her tomatoes from a neighbor's garden when mine had failed. I fixed the storm door at her house that had been sticking since her husband died, and I discovered I liked being useful to her in that small, quiet way. She started calling to ask my advice about her car, though I suspected some of those calls had less to do with the car than with wanting to hear a voice on the other end of the line. We started meeting for coffee most Thursdays, not planned exactly, just a habit that grew up between us the way habits do, until one Thursday in November, sitting in the same booth at the Millbrook Diner, she reached across the table
and put her hand over mine, the way she must have done 1,000 times with Eleanor over 50 years of friendship. Except this time, neither of us moved our hand away. "I'm scared, Walter," she said, "of what people will say, of what your children will say, of what it means about the kind of woman I am, that I let myself feel something for my best friend's husband before her graves even had time to settle. She'd been gone almost 15 months by the time you said anything," I said. "That's not betrayal, Grace. That's just 2 lonely old people who happen to love the same woman finding each other in the wreckage she left behind. You make it sound simple. It isn't simple, but it's true." She didn't pull her hand back, and for the first time in 14 months, I let myself imagine, just for a moment, what it might feel like to not be alone at that kitchen table with the window that caught the morning light. But imagining and doing are different animals, and it would take a phone call from my daughter 3 days later to remind me just how complicated the simple truth could get. My daughter Denise is 42, lives 2 hours away in Columbus with her husband and my 2 grandchildren, and she calls me every Sunday evening like clockwork, a habit Eleanor started and Denise had simply continued after her mother died, as if the ritual itself was a kind of thread keeping the family stitched together. That particular Sunday she asked, almost offhand, how the week had gone, and I made the mistake of mentioning, just in passing, that Grace Whitfield had come by to help me pick out new curtains for the living room. Grace Whitfield, Denise repeated. Aunt Grace? Mom's Grace? She's not really your aunt, honey. You know that. Just an old family friend. Dad, she was Mom's best friend for 50 years. What do you mean she came by to help you pick curtains? It's not what you're thinking, Denise. What am I thinking? I don't know, but your voice has already decided it's something scandalous. And it isn't. We've had coffee a few times. She's been a friend to me since your mother passed. That's all it is. Dad, I love you, and I know how hard this year has been. Harder than I think you've even let yourself admit to me. But you cannot be serious about Grace Whitfield. She was Mom's person. If something happened between the two of you, it would feel like Mom got replaced by her own best friend. Do you understand how that would look? I'm not trying to replace anybody. Then what are you trying to do? I sat there in Eleanor's recliner with the phone pressed to my ear, and for a moment I honestly didn't have an answer, because the truth, that I was trying to find some reason to get out of bed in the morning that wasn't just habit and grief, felt too fragile to say out loud to my own child. I don't know yet, I finally admitted, but I know Grace has been the first good thing to happen to me since your mother died, and I'm not ready to throw that away just because it's complicated. Denise was quiet a long moment. Please just be careful, Dad. Not with your heart, with everyone else's. Grace has children too. This isn't just about you and her. She hung up gentler than she'd started, but the conversation sat in my chest like a stone for the rest of the night, and it was still sitting there 3 days later when I drove out to see Grace and found her on her porch, already crying, a phone clutched in her hand. Her son Peter had called that morning, having heard through some cousin of a cousin that his mother had been seen more than once at the Millbrook Diner with Walter Combs, and had said some things Grace wouldn't repeat to me, except that the word disrespectful had come up more than once. He thinks I'm making a fool of myself, she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her wrist. An old woman throwing herself at her dead friend's husband. That's what he thinks, Walter, even if he didn't say those exact words. Denise called me too, I admitted, sitting down beside her on the porch step. Same conversation, different names. What did you tell her? That I didn't know what I was doing yet, but that you were the first good thing to happen to me in 14 months. Grace let out a small broken laugh. That's a low bar, Walter. Maybe, but it's an honest one. We sat there on her porch as the afternoon light slanted gold across her yard, both of us carrying the weight of being loved by children, trying, clumsily, to protect us from a mistake that hadn't happened yet. I keep thinking about something my mother used to say, Grace said, after a long while, that grief has no schedule and love has no manners. It doesn't wait for the appropriate season to show up. It just shows up whenever it wants, whether or not the people around you have finished mourning on your behalf. Did your mother really say that, or did you just make it sound wise because you needed to hear it? She smiled despite herself. A little of both, probably. That evening, I sat for a long time at the kitchen table, in the chair across from where Eleanor used to sit, and found myself talking to her again, right there in the kitchen where she'd died. The radio silent, 41 years of marriage pressing down on me. I don't know what you'd want me to do, Ellie, I said out loud, feeling foolish and not caring. I don't know if this is a betrayal, or if it's exactly the kind of thing you'd have pushed me toward yourself, knowing you, always trying to fix everybody's loneliness before your own. I just know that for the first time in over a year, I don't dread waking up in the morning, and it scares me half to death that the reason is Grace. The house didn't answer, of course, but saying it out loud settled a little of the storm in my chest, enough that I slept that night without the usual hollow ache. The weeks that followed were harder than the weeks before them. Not because anything went wrong between Grace and me, but because the outside pressure, from Denise, from Peter, from the particular kind of small-town gossip that moves through a place like Millbrook faster than weather, kept finding new cracks to work itself into. Grace stopped answering my calls as quickly as she used to. When we did meet, there was a new caution in her, like a woman bracing against a wind she knew was coming. She had spent 70 years being the reliable one, and the idea of being talked about cut against everything she'd built her life to be. It came to a head on the first Sunday of December, at the cemetery, the same place where all of this had started. I arrived to find Grace already there, but this time she wasn't alone. Denise stood beside her, arms crossed, and a few feet away, near his own mother's headstone. Peter stood with his hands in his coat pockets, his jaw set in a way that told me this had been arranged, that my daughter and Grace's son had found each other through whatever family network these things travel, and decided the two of them needed to have this conversation with both of us present, out here among the dead, as if the setting itself might lend their argument some moral weight. "Dad," Denise said, before I'd even gotten out of the car, "we need to talk, all of us." I walked over and stood beside Grace, who looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, her hands wrapped tight around a bundle of daisies she hadn't yet laid down. "I think you both know why we're here," Peter said, his voice careful, the voice of a man trying very hard to sound reasonable instead of angry. "Mom, Mr. Combs, people are talking. And honestly, we're worried. Mom, you buried Dad 11 years ago, and you never once looked at another man. And now suddenly you're at the diner every week with your best friend's husband, not even 2 years after she passed. Doesn't that concern you at all?" "It concerns me plenty, Peter," Grace said, her voice steadier than I expected. "I've thought about almost nothing else for 2 months. "Then why keep doing it?" Denise cut in. "Dad, Mom's only been gone 14 months. Do you know how that looks? To everyone who knew her, to everyone who came to her funeral and watched you grieve her. It looks like you couldn't even wait a full year and a half before moving on to her best friend." The word "moving on" landed like a slap, and I felt something in me go hard and cold in a way it hadn't in a long time. "I haven't moved on from your mother," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended. "I don't think I ever will. Not completely, not if I live another 30 years. But I also don't think your mother, of all people, would want me sitting alone in that house until the day I die, just to prove to the neighbors that I loved her properly. She wasn't that kind of woman, Denise, and you know it." "That's not the point, Dad." "Then tell me what the point is, because from where I'm standing, the point seems to be that you and Peter have decided grief has a schedule, and Grace and I are running late on it." Peter's jaw tightened. "The point is that this is my mother, and I've watched her be strong for other people her whole life. My father's drinking, your wife's illness, scares, everybody else's crises, and I will not stand by and watch her get talked about at the grocery store because she let herself get lonely enough to fall for the first available man who was nice to her." Grace flinched at that, and something in me broke a little. Watching her flinch, watching her son, trying to protect her, wound her instead without even realizing it. "Peter," she said quietly, "look at me. I am 70 years old. I buried your father, and I grieved him honestly, even though our marriage was hard, because that's what you do when you've given someone 30 years of your life. And then I grieved my best friend, the woman I loved like a sister for half a century, and I am still grieving her every single day, and I will be grieving her on the day I die, whether that's next year or 20 years from now. Walter isn't the first available man who was nice to me. He's the only man in 70 years who has looked at me the way Eleanor used to talk about being looked at, and I am done apologizing for noticing it." The cemetery went quiet except for the wind moving through the cypress trees. Denise looked at me, and for the first time in the conversation I saw something crack in her anger, some old grief of her own working its way to the surface. "I miss her too, Dad," she said, her voice suddenly small. "I miss Mom so much some days I can't breathe. And I think part of me is angry because if you move forward, if you're happy again, it feels like it makes room for me to actually finish grieving her too. And I'm not ready for that room to open up yet." I walked over and put my arms around my daughter, the way I hadn't in longer than either of us could probably say. And she let me. Stiff at first and then not stiff at all, her shoulders shaking against my chest. "I'm not asking you to finish grieving her," I said into her hair. "None of us ever will, not completely. I'm just asking you to let me try to build something out of what's left of me, instead of asking me to spend the rest of my life standing guard over a grave." Peter had gone quiet too, watching his mother, who stood with her daisies still clutched in her hands, tears sliding down a face that had spent 70 years being the strong one for everybody else. "Mom," he finally said, his voice cracking, "I'm not trying to punish you for being happy. I just don't know how to watch you take a risk like this, at your age, after everything you already survived." "That's exactly why I have to take it, Peter," Grace said. "At my age, there isn't time left to wait for the world to be tidy before I let myself want something. Your father taught me that lesson the hard way. All those years I waited for him to change, waited for things to get easier before I let myself really live. I'm not doing that again, not with however many years I have left." Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Denise pulled back from my chest, wiped her eyes with her sleeve, and looked over at Grace with an expression I hadn't seen on her since she was a little girl, something between grief and grudging understanding. Mom would have liked her, Denise said quietly, almost to herself. She always said Aunt Grace had better sense than anybody else she knew. Grace let out a wet, surprised laugh. Your mother said that because I was usually the one telling her to stop letting your father overwork himself into the ground. She used to say it about you too, Denise said, looking at me now, that you were the only reason she trusted the world to keep turning right. The four of us stood there a long while after that, letting the weight of it settle, the grief and fear and small fragile hope that underneath all the arguing, we were just frightened people trying to protect the ones we loved. Peter walked over eventually and shook my hand, an awkward formal gesture that felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. I don't know what this is going to become, he said, but I'm not going to stand in the way of it either. Just take care of her, Mr. Combs. She's given enough of herself to people who didn't deserve it. I know exactly what she's worth, Peter, I said. I've known it for 40 years. I was just too married to say it out loud. That night, Grace and I sat together on her porch, wrapped in blankets against the cold. That went better than I expected, she said. Barely. I meant it, what I said out there, about there not being time left to wait. I know you did. She turned to look at me, her face lit soft by the porch light, 70 years old and still, somehow, nervous as a girl. Walter, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly, not kindly. All right. Is this about Eleanor? Are you reaching for me because I'm the closest thing left to her, the person who can still talk about her the way you need somebody to? Or is this actually about me? I took her hand, the same hand that had reached for mine across a diner table 2 months earlier, and held it the way I used to hold Eleanor's hand on our porch 40 years ago, before either of us knew how the story would end. The first time I sat with you at that cemetery, I thought I was just grateful for somebody who understood my grief, I said. But somewhere between the tomatoes and the storm door and every Thursday since, I stopped thinking about you as Eleanor's friend who happened to be there, and I started thinking about you as Grace. Just Grace, a woman I'd apparently been too married and too blind to notice clearly for 40 years. I loved your best friend with everything I had, Grace, and I'm not asking you to compete with that memory. I'm asking if there's room for you to become something entirely your own, next to it, not instead of it. She was quiet a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had the particular steadiness of a woman who had finally decided to stop being afraid of her own answer. I've loved 2 people honestly in my life, she said. My husband, though it cost me plenty, and Eleanor, my whole life, in the way only another woman can love a friend who's seen every version of her. I never expected there to be room for a third kind of love, not at my age, not with everything already decided about how the rest of my life was supposed to go. But I think I've been in love with the idea of you since the day you drove me home from that first coffee, and I think I've spent 2 months being too frightened to say so because I didn't know how to want something this much again. I kissed her then, on her porch, in the cold December air, both of us 70-something years old and shaking slightly, not from the temperature. It wasn't the reckless kiss of young people who don't yet know how much life can take from you. It was slower than that, more careful, the kind of kiss that understood exactly what it was risking and chose to risk it anyway. When we finally pulled apart, Grace pressed her forehead against mine and laughed, a small, disbelieving sound. Eleanor is never going to let either of us live this down, wherever she is, she said. I think she'd have arranged it herself if she'd had the chance, I said, and I meant it more than I expected to when the words came out. We were married the following June, in a small ceremony in Grace's backyard, under the same maple tree where she used to sit with Eleanor decades earlier, drinking iced tea and complaining about their husbands, back when both of us were younger and neither of them could have imagined the 2 of us standing here now. Denise stood beside me. Peter stood beside his mother. Neither of them cried during the vows, though I noticed both of them wiping their eyes more than once. In my vows, I told Grace that I had spent 41 years loving one good woman, without ever imagining that a second good woman had been standing quietly at the edges of that life the whole time, watching, caring, becoming someone I would one day be lucky enough to know in an entirely different way. I told her that grief, real grief, doesn't close a door behind it the way people expect. Sometimes it opens one you never even knew was there. Grace, in her vows, said that she had spent 70 years believing love was something that happened to you once, if you were lucky, and that everything after was just the long, quiet business of managing what was left. She said I had taught her that love could still arrive late, could still arrive complicated, could still arrive wearing another woman's absence like a shadow, and be real anyway, be worth everything anyway. We built a life together neither of us had expected to need. Close enough to visit Eleanor's grave every Sunday, which we still do, together now, 2 bundles of flowers instead of 1. Denise brings her children to see us most months, and somewhere along the way she started calling Grace by her first name instead of Aunt Grace, which felt, to both of us, like its own quiet kind of blessing. Peter still checks in more than he probably needs to, but his voice has lost the sharp edge it carried that first Sunday in the cemetery, replaced now with something closer to relief, the relief of a son who watched his mother finally stop apologizing for wanting to be happy. Some nights, sitting on our porch with Grace's hand in mine, I think about that Sunday I knelt at Eleanor's grave and told her, out loud foolishly, that I was too old for anything new. I think about how wrong I was, and how right I was too, in a way, because I was too old for anything reckless, anything shallow, anything built on less than the whole truth of 2 long lives finally recognizing each other. What I wasn't too old for, it turned out, was this: a second spring, arriving not instead of the first one, but alongside it, in the quiet space grief leaves behind, when you finally stop guarding it like a wound, and start letting it become instead the ground something new can grow in. If you've ever loved someone you thought you'd lost the chance to love, you'll understand exactly what I mean when I say it isn't too late, not at 68, not at 70, not at any age life hasn't finished handing you yet. Love doesn't end when we bury the people who taught us how to feel it. Sometimes, if we're patient enough and brave enough, and willing to kneel in the wet grass and say the truth out loud, it simply learns a new name and waits for us to catch up.